Welcome to the Tom Nelson podcast. Today, I'm happy to have Andrew Montford here, aka Bishop Hill. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself to get this kicked off, please?
Yeah, so my title is Deputy Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation and also Deputy Director of Net Zero Watch, which are two organizations involved in the global warming and energy debate in the UK. I guess further back, there's quite a lot of people will know me as the host of the Bishop Hill blog, which was something I did for quite a long time before climate and energy became my job rather than just a hobby.
How did you become known as Bishop Hill?
Okay, so I live in the middle of nowhere. I live in a little village in rural Scotland. I had decided I was going to launch a blog. This was, 15 years ago now, maybe. I was looking around for a title. At the time, there was a blog called Arthur's Seat. Now, Arthur's Seat is a hill in the middle of Edinburgh. The guy who wrote the blog, the idea was that he was on the top of Arthur's Seat, looking down on the city and looking at all the weird things that people were getting up to, and was writing about them. And I liked that idea, and I thought, I kind of looked out of my bedroom window and I saw the local hill, which is called Bishop Hill. And I went, yeah, okay, I could be Bishop Hill. And it worked quite well as this sort of alter ego that I was, so as I got into blogging, I eventually became the Bishop, which always made me laugh, as I'm not a religious person at all. Here, I'll tell you a secret. So on my Twitter icon, as it were, is what everybody takes to be a cross. Now, if you're a typographer, you know that it's not a cross at all. It's a dagger. So it's actually nothing to do with religion at all. It's just, I was looking for something vaguely cross-shaped and came across a typographical dagger. So yeah, that's how I became the bishop. But I mean, I was like a nobody blogs for like years, and I was sort of writing I was writing about anything that took my fancy. It was sort of libertarian stuff and a bit of politics. Yeah, occasionally I get into a bit of science and stuff like that. And I mean, my readership was like 15, 20 people a day. I mean, it really was pathetic. Nobody was interested in anything I had to say until one day I wrote a blog post about the work that Steve McIntyre was doing on Michael Mann's hockey stick graph, which I'm guessing none of your readers probably need explained. Do we need to explain that, Tom?
I think it wouldn't hurt actually just to mention it.
Okay, so the hockey stick graph was this famous graph that suggested that temperatures had been stable or slightly falling until around the year 1900, when industrialization took off, and then they suddenly shot up. So it was shaped like an ice hockey stick. And Steve McIntyre was the Canadian blogger, statistician who spent many years investigating how this graph had been put together, or fighting to find out how it was put together, because Michael Mann, the author of the paper, didn't want to tell him. So I wrote a blog post about just a small part of the story. I just read this amazing finding that McIntyre had made. And I'm not a statistician, okay, but I worked out enough to realize just how astonishing what McIntyre had found was. And I wrote a blog post about it. And it was just extraordinary, because the next day I had 30,000 readers, and I'm going, this is just amazing. Okay, there's a market for this. And I mean, that's kind of where my blogging changed direction. And I started to be a science blogger, writing about climate science and then latterly energy, because I think I felt that there was a place for somebody like me who's got I've got a science degree, and I've also been involved in sort of writing quite a lot, and I felt there was a role for me to explain all the thing that the internet geeks were discovering. Because I mean, this was still relatively early days for the internet, of course, and in the blogosphere of the time, you had really clever people like Steve McIntyre, Anthony Watts, people like that, bright guys, just saying there's something very, very wrong here. But it got technical very quickly, and I felt my role was to take their geeky findings and turn them into something that the man in the street, or perhaps, well, maybe not everybody in the street, but the educated man in the street could understand, and just trying to get the jargon out of it and sort of turn it into something a bit more digestible. And yeah, so I sort of did that for many years. I mean, it was a lot of fun, actually, those days in the blogosphere. was great fun, wasn't it? I mean, you were around then.
It was very fun. I would like to ask, were you involved in the controversy back when there was no climate audit or real climate blog, even before that?
Yeah, I can still remember when I got my first dial-up internet connection, going to I mean, what is almost a legendary site still? Do you remember Still Waiting for Greenhouse?
I remember hearing about it. I wasn't involved.
So it was run by this. He was a retired teacher in Tasmania. I can't even remember his name now. And he wrote this site called Still Waiting for Greenhouse. And he was just picking out stuff and saying, this doesn't look right. I don't believe this. And I had always had this sense that it was all too clean and simple. I didn't really trust it. And I guess I'm probably not a very trusting person, really. So I guess I was naturally open to people saying, yeah, this isn't right. So yeah, that was really very early days. So I was following it reasonably closely then, but not sort of within the sort of slightly obsessive detail that it got to once McIntyre appeared on the scene. And it was at that point, it was getting really interesting. And I was having to work quite hard at it then, of course, because I'm not a statistician. So, trying to, once McIntyre starts talking about, correlation coefficients and things and some of the more abstruse statistics, I had to really work quite hard to get my head around. But, that was half the pleasure in a way, was trying to get my head around what these experts were saying and trying to understand it. And, it was great you could ask people in the comments and they'd sort of tell you what it all meant and that sort of thing. And yeah, it was a great learning experience. Good fun.
Yeah. So as we were talking about before we started recording, I've just been reading your hockey stick illusion and on Kindle, and I've been loving it. I think you've done a great job of translating the low level stuff that McIntyre and McKittrick were talking about into levels that we can understand. And I don't know, do you have some highlights you'd like to talk about what you wrote about there? It's so many farcical things happened, it seemed like, in those early days with the goings on between Mann and McIntyre.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was the story of the hockey stick. There are just so many moments in it where you're just astonished that they got away with what they got away with. I mean, I still love the story of McIntyre going off to the woods in California, was it Colorado? Can't remember, looking for the original trees that had been sampled for these bristlecone pine trees, which had the signal of global warming. And he found it wasn't anything to do with that. They have a thing called strip barking where a bit of bark falls off on one side of the tree and the other side of the tree gets a growth pulse. So what they were actually seeing was actually nothing to do with the climate at all. But this graph, which said it was down to global warming, then made it into was the front page of the the IPCC third assessment report, and was defended to the death. And they still defend it to the death. You still can't criticize the hockey stick. They still won't admit that it was a farce. It's absolutely amazing and destroys your whole confidence in institutional science in a way. And I mean, again, we were talking about this before we came on air. It is still selling, the book. And I think that's because people just go, my God, institutional science is corrupt. And it is. And it's rather scary.
Yeah, that was a huge eye-opener for me, this whole story, to see how we can't trust science. Because I did believe in the climate scam at first. I think Tony Heller did, Anthony Watts. So I think you might be more of the exception than the rule for climate skeptics, where you never actually bought it, right?
I would say I never actually bought it. No, I think it's my naturally distrusting instinct. And, you can get it wrong as often as you get it right. When it's so clean and simple and that there's no doubt about it, allegedly, to me, that just sends warning signals. And I just go, no, I don't trust this. If people tell me to go and do something, I instinctively go, well, why do they want me to do that? I'm not sure I trust them. So, yeah.
Good for you. Let's talk about some of the details of hiding the decline. What actually was that?
Okay, so we sort of come back to, this was sort of a later stage of my blogging. And just one evening, I had a message left on my blog in a comment by somebody saying, there's a whole lot of emails come out from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia, and it is amazing, and you have to go and see them. And I was downloading them from this Russian server, going, oh my God, I'm going to get every virus known to man. But I was so desperate to get my hands on it, so I downloaded it. And so this was Climategate, where there was thousands and thousands of emails about climate scientists communicating with each other and doing lots of bad stuff. And this was quite exciting for me, because this was probably about a month before the hockey stick illusion was going to be published. And of course, all the bad guys in the hockey stick illusion were also involved in the Climategate emails. It was quite funny, because the first thing, I sort of phoned my publisher up in great excitement and said that this was happening, and he said, did you have anything to do with with the leak of the emails? And I had to assure him that no, I didn't. I was a mild-mannered ex-accountant from Scotland, and no, wasn't into hacking things. But of course, it was great publicity. It was quite interesting, because of course we then pushed it quite hard. We say, Montford is the guy who knows all about these people, and you should be talking to him. Nobody wanted to talk to me, though. I mean, it was amazing from the first moments. The cover up was there. The media didn't want to talk about it, with one exception. Actually, I had one interview, which was from a very surprising quarter. I bet you can't guess who it was.
I can't.
It was the BBC.
Okay.
The BBC did actually come and interview me, and the guys who did it were they were actually pretty reasonable, to tell the truth. The journalist actually said he had read all the emails before he came to see me, which I thought, wow, that's pretty professional. I'm not sure you get many journalists doing that. But yeah, so it was very exciting. So huge scandal, and obviously it was all covered up. But I wrote a book about that as well, which was called Hiding the Decline, about how the emails came out, and essentially how institutional science then tried to cover up for the scientists. So we had a whole series of inquiries here in the UK, which were more or less whitewashes. I mean, they were absolutely appalling in places. It was quite fun, because we had just got a Freedom of Information Act in the UK for the first time, and people were still getting to grips with the fact that you could now just go and try and get scientists' emails and other stuff through the front door, as it were. We got some of the emails relating to one of the inquiries, and there was some quite prominent scientists, including a former head of the Royal Society, discussing how they would try to get 3 people who were on side on the panel, and they would have 3 people who would be neutral. And I think that was sort of, trying to hedge their bets correctly, so that, they would expect the neutrals to come out 50-50 for and against, and they would still come out with a majority saying that it was all fine, and no matter what happened. And, we got stuff like the timetable for the visit of the panel to the when they did their main investigation, when they were at the university itself. And, there was lunch, there was breakfast, there was a coffee break, and they actually only interviewed the guys involved for about 45 minutes. It was a joke. They had a list of papers that they were going to discuss with the scientists. And they were all a list of papers that had not been criticized by any of the skeptics. The whole thing was a fix, basically. So anyways, I wrote a book about that, and yeah, it wasn't a great story like the hockey stick illusion. The hockey stick illusion was a detective story, and you could read it as a scientific detective story. Hiding the Decline was, it needed to be recorded for posterity, just what these guys got up to. And yeah, it wasn't good, but as a story, it wasn't such a great read.
But Hiding the Decline itself, it's absolutely critical, right? That we're supposed to spend $40 trillion based on this idea that the temperatures were a hockey stick, and that tree rings are thermometers, but they're not.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, I don't think it's as central to the case for energy policy as you suggest there. I mean, one of the things I actually say in the hockey stick illusion was that, in fact, both Mann and McIntyre agreed that the hockey stick was largely irrelevant to the question of whether you should do it, because temperatures could be unprecedented now, and it could, or not, and it doesn't really make a difference. It's what they're going to be in the future, which is I guess the important question. So yeah, it's important. There's a whole chapter at the end of the hockey stick illusion about the importance of the hockey stick graph And it's more about institutional science and the fact that science, climate science at least, and really, I think in reality, a lot of other science too, is now very, very biased and isn't capable of managing itself and regulating itself. It's now, yeah, it was amazing that this graph, which was so flawed, got through peer review and was defended to death by institutional science, in spite of all the evidence that it was wrong. I mean, that tells you there's a problem. And when when the IPCC was defending it as well, these are the guys who are deciding our futures for us, and they're defending it. And yeah, that's a concern. That's a concern.
Yeah, I do think still it's a central part of the sales pitch. Definitely, the IPCC was featuring it everywhere for a while,
Correct.
right? And then didn't they send it around to every household in Canada? Isn't that how McIntyre found out about it?
Yeah, that's how McIntyre found out about it. It did go to every household. But yeah, very much it was a sales tool. And the fact that climate science needed a sales tool tells you something, doesn't it? It tells you that they're trying to sell you something. And again, this comes back to my not being very trusting thing, because of course I think I will have detected a sales tool, and gone, okay, they're trying to sell me something.
Yeah, I think McIntyre had seen tons of them in his previous life, right? Of hockey sticks, and they were bogus.
Yeah, he said it was a big. So McIntyre was a mining engineer, mining analyst, and he said that a hockey stick is actually a well-known thing in amongst geologists. Look, there's oil here, look at this hockey stick, and you put them in front of an investor, and if they're a bit gullible, you'll get your money. So it's interesting that I think that it spans those two worlds.
So all sorts of cherry picking needed to be done to produce the hockey stick, right? I read some of your book about that, about how there was a meeting where, was it Roseanne d'Arago? I don't know how to pronounce her name. She was saying that if you want to make a cherry pie, you have to do some cherry picking.
To pick cherries.
You can't just randomly pick trees or whatever. You got to pick the correct trees so that you get the answer that you want. It seems like such a farce to me.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I find most remarkable is that they would say these things completely openly. Yes, of course we're cherry picking. You don't get the right answer otherwise, and you're going, it's not how I was brought up to do science. But I mean, clearly that's how it's done in the climate science world. There was, again, you probably remember this. Back in the days of the climate wars or the climate blog wars, and people saying, that's not all climate scientists. Climate, there's a lot of good guys in there, and I guess probably there are probably good climate scientists, but there are not many good scientists who will speak up and say there's a problem, because we get back into stuff like cancel culture, don't we?
Absolutely.
There are the stories of your climate scientists being shunned and demonized for saying something out of line. It tells a story, doesn't it? That we have a big problem. I think climate science has led society to a very dangerous, I think. I mean, I don't know what it's like over in the States. I think you're probably a bit less dutiful than us here. I mean, I think most of UK society has been completely led astray by the climate scientists, and we've gone off the rails. We're sitting here wondering whether the lights are going to stay on this winter. I mean, it's quite scary.
Yeah. We can talk about that right now if you want. What's happening in the UK? How the climate scam is hitting home in the UK? It looks like it is to me.
Yeah, I mean, it has hit home pretty hard. I mean, the problem we have is that all of the political machinery has bought into it. And even people who don't believe, even politicians who don't really believe it, feel they have to say, yeah, we're going to decarbonize. Yeah, all this sort of thing. And, to say we're not, I mean, one of the things that I feel has to happen now is we have to say we can't do net zero. We can't decarbonize completely. It is going to be a disaster. But no politician is going to say that at the moment. And that is scary because, at the moment, there are a lot of stories in the press saying there is a serious chance we will run out of gas this winter. And if we run out of gas, then the gas-fired power stations switch off, so we have blackouts. And that is going to be interesting because it's going to wake a lot of people up. For a long time, I've been saying that we won't get sanity restored until bad things happen. And, to that extent, Mr. Putin may have done us a favor by invading the Ukraine, because it has brought the bad things forward, and they're going to happen now rather than in 5 or 6 years' time. So, if every cloud has a silver lining, it could mean that we just, we turn onto a different track sooner. But I also worry that we are not, that people are so bought into this that actually it's not going to be bad enough. Blackouts, a few weeks of blackouts isn't going to be enough to make them turn. They're just going to go, well, we need to do more. We need more wind farms. We need fewer fossil fuel power stations. And yeah, I think it could get really bad. That's what worries me. So, I mean, we're in some ways we're lucky because we're a little bit behind some of our European friends. So the Germans are in real trouble now. I think Italy is in real trouble now. We are a little bit behind them. So we're not quite as bad. And I think America, I think you are quite a long way behind, but catching up fast, I think.
So do you get a sense that voters in the UK are really into the climate scam, and they think the weather's getting so bad and they want it to be colder outside?
It's not a feeling I get very often here in Scotland. It remains cold and wet most of the time. I don't understand why. You can't reason with these people, can you? You can show them a graph showing them that hurricanes aren't getting worse, and it's like talking to a brick wall. They don't care. They've seen the videos on the news. They saw Hurricane Ian and they go, well, there we are. Look, it's an emergency, and you can't reason with, what is it? There's the famous quote, isn't it? Is it Jonathan Swift or somebody? You can't reason somebody out of a position into which they didn't reason themselves in the first place. And that's what it's all about. So this is what it's very depressing in a way, because if you can't reason them out of it, how do you get them out of it? And I think that is the only way they will ever fix themselves is for there to be a disaster, and then they'll suddenly wake up and go, well, maybe actually maybe there is, maybe I need to look again at this global warming stuff, because I'm really not enjoying it here with no heating and no lights.
Are there any signs of hope with Liz Truss? Or are they restarting a fracking over in the UK?
They're talking about it. It's very, that's okay. They've lifted the moratorium as I understand it, so people can go and frack, but the regulations are still insane. So we have, if there's any induced seismicity, so if they cause any minor earth tremors, they have to stop. And the seismicity level is set at 0.5 on the Richter scale, which essentially means, if anybody drops their lunchbox on the floor, you have to stop working. I mean, this is so mad. It's not true. The level was put in essentially to try to kill the industry. So that's got to go. But I mean, I can remember talking to a guy in the shale industry some years ago. We sort of met at a party, and he said he would never get involved in the UK shale industry because the regulation here is so insane. I mean, the shale industry in the States, you go and drill a well. If it doesn't work, you go and drill another well, and you try a slightly different recipe until you hit on the one that works. In the UK, you drill, it takes you 2 or 3 years to apply for permission to drill the well. And if it doesn't work, well, you go back and apply for permission to drill another well, and that takes another 2 or 3 years. So, the idea, it's with the current regulatory regime, it is unlikely we're going to get off the ground anytime soon. I think Liz Truss may understand this, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's the business and energy guy in the cabinet, I think they probably do understand this. But the problem is that there are large chunks of their party are not really on board with that objective. They are essentially environmentalists, and think that we can get by with a few more wind farms and maybe a couple of batteries or something, and we'll be fine. people have been tricked. They think that we can manage the country with wind farms and with, well, the thing they always say is storage. They never actually tell you what kind of storage, or this is a great trick I've noticed a lot, is always you just give the generic name, and then people are less likely to ask awkward questions like, how much does that cost? So if you say batteries, okay, well, batteries, $350 per kilowatt hour for a grid scale battery. So, okay, that's 350 billion per terawatt hour. Okay, and we need to store, okay, we use about 1 terawatt hour a day in the UK, right? For seasonal storage, you probably need 60 days. So if you can multiply 60 times 350 billion, you start to get in quite big numbers. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of pounds per household. But there are people who believe that that's what we have to do, because they're caught up in this climate change thing of it's an emergency. Therefore, you don't worry about cost. You just do whatever it takes. And I mean, that is what has got us to the situation we're in now, where we are looking at, really a scary winter ahead, and probably the next 2 or 3 after that at least are looking scary as well, because it's very unlikely we're going to be able to get major amounts, even if we do frack. It's not happening in the next 12 months. We might get a little bit for next winter, but you want big amounts, you're talking 4 or 5 years down the line. This has been a 20-year attack on our energy system, and you're not going to fix it in 2 or 3 years.
Is climate the big reason why people oppose fracking in the UK, or are they worried about earthquakes? The earthquake thing is a secondary.
I think the people complaining about earthquakes, this is behind it all is climate. Yeah, they don't care what arguments they make. They just want the arguments to be effective, but behind it all is climate. A few years ago, I went up, there's a little gas field it's about 40-minute drive away on the Firth of Forth place in Falkirk. This was, and they had just got up and running. It wasn't actually shale, it was coal bed methane, and people had been trying to actually get gas out of the coal seams for quite a long time there, and it had changed hands several times, but they had just got it working. And the process they used just involved drilling a hole and you're pumping out pressure. It was a U-shaped hole. You pump out pressure at one end and the gas comes out of the other, something like that. No fracking involved. But the moment they said, haha, we've made it work, we're going to go into full-scale production now, the environmentalists descended on the area. They went round and leafleted every house. They said, these guys are going to frack. They're going to poison you. Your water will be poisonous. They said, you'll get earthquakes. And 6 months later, they were closed down by the government. They said, we're just not going to do this anymore. It was a campaign of lies. And that's kind of what we're up against here. If they tried to start fracking down in England again, in the shale beds in Lancashire, the same thing will happen. The campaign of lies will start again. And yeah, I think there is a serious possibility that it just won't ever get off the ground. But you hope that a few power cuts will concentrate minds. That's the great hope, I guess.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about what you're doing now then with GWPF. Yours is a campaign of truth, right? You're
absolutely, yeah.
The lies, yeah.
Not if you believe what's said about us on the internet.
I don't.
So GWPF, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, we were set up in 2009, end of 2009, essentially to give the non-socially acceptable views on climate change, that there were questions that needed to be asked and questions that needed to be answered, and that maybe going hell for leather for wind farms was not actually a very good idea, all these kinds of questions. So GWPF is tiny. There's 4 members of staff, not all of whom are full-time. But I guess we probably make an impact bigger than we should do, given how few of us there are, if only because there's nobody else saying the things that we're saying. The media has tried very hard to ignore us. I mean, they paid some attention when we first when we first appeared, but yeah, after a while, I think word went round that it was better if they just ignored us, and so we've been ignored by most of the media for for many years. In the last 12 months, it's all suddenly started getting interesting because suddenly I think I think what's happened is that energy has stopped being about a story that gets given to the environmental correspondent. It gets given to the political correspondents now, and the political correspondents are going, okay, let's hear the other view. And, which is not really, I think it's upset a few people, but yeah. So we now get attention from the media, and we are starting to get our views out there in some of the press. There are certain, obviously the Guardian is never going to say anything, report our views, and the BBC has long since banned us. But yeah, other places will, and word is getting out. So that's nice. The other thing to say about GWPF is that we have now split into two organizations. So we have GWPF is a charity. It's an educational charity, and the rules around what it can and can't do are somewhat arbitrary, but have been interpreted in our case very strictly. So essentially, the charity has to restrict itself to really just producing worthy reports. So we now have a campaigning organization which is separate. It's separately funded, which can do the slightly stronger stuff and say things that are, I guess, more directly policy relevant. We can criticize existing policy and in fact we're very critical of most people's policies, because none of the UK political parties, or none of the big ones anyway, have even remotely sensible. They are completely pie in the sky policies. And I guess the joy of the federal system in the States is that you can at least find states with sensible leaderships who do sensible things. Here it's all run by Westminster, and they all have the same groupthink. So yeah, so Net Zero Watch has been quite exciting because we have, again, it's just a bit slicker in terms of getting the message out there and getting stuff out on social media and stuff. So that's been quite exciting. I've suddenly found myself being interviewed on radio stations and TV stations and things like that, which really hadn't. As I say, 10 years ago, it happened a little bit, and suddenly, it's like 4 or 5 interviews a week, and sometimes, which is great, because it means the message is getting out there. So yeah, that's been a nice change. I don't know. You always worry whether you're preaching to the converted on these things, though, because it's the same radio stations and TV stations who come around all the time, and you go, okay, I think your audience probably are on our side already, and of course it's getting to the neutral people, which is the difficult problem. And the people who don't care about social media and the news, it's how do you get to those people? It's a difficult one.
Well, I'm glad you're getting interviewed, though. That's a huge positive that you're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. The media landscape in the UK has changed a lot in the last 12, 18 months, because we've had GB News, a new TV station, which has been really very successful. They've grown very quickly. They've been very slick, mainly by dint of reporting all the stories that the rest of the press really don't want reported. So they've done a lot of stuff on asking questions about the COVID pandemic that other people didn't want asked. They've done climate change quite a lot, that kind of thing. And occasionally, I think they go into places where I'm not very comfortable. They're quite big on the WEF. They're quite, which I'm just kind of go, I'm not sure this isn't a conspiracy theory, but not sure. But yeah, they've been good. There's another radio station in London called Talk Radio, which has been very good on just sort of saying, they're very good actually in picking up on the madness of the climate stuff. All the crazy protesters, Extinction Rebellion, people like that. They're very good at picking up on that and just saying, these people are mad, aren't they? And why are our politicians listening to, a 15-year-old Swedish truant? And which, I think in a couple of decades time, people are going to look back and say, yeah, society kind of lost the plot there a bit. Absolutely. Didn't it?
Can you explain the relationship between Great Britain News or GB News, Talk TV and Talk Radio? Are they connected?
Okay, so GB News is just entirely separate. Talk TV and Talk Radio is essentially the same thing. I think they changed their name from Talk Radio to Talk TV just because they thought they were going to focus more on the TV end of it. But it's the same show going out with a picture and without a picture. So yeah.
So Talk TV and GB News, they are kind of competitors with each other.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. Are they on actual cable TV or are they just internet only? Either one of those?
No, you can't. Well, cable TV isn't really a thing in the UK, but you can get them over a TV aerial the same way you can get the BBC. Yeah, they are mainstream to that extent. And certainly GB News, I believe, has got quite a lot of money behind them. They have proper studios in London, and they have dozens of journalists and researchers and things. So yeah, it's a serious operation. It's quite interesting. It's interesting in this day when you can do essentially the same job from your front room in Minnesota on a shoestring, that they've chosen to go down this very expensive route. We're interested to see whether it proves more successful. I mean, they're certainly doing very well at the moment, I believe.
Can you talk about some of the people who are behind GWPF or who are working on it, and also Net Zero Watch?
Okay, so essentially there are four of us in both organizations. The four of us have to cover both aspects of the work. And so, we have to divide our time between doing the charitable work. I actually spend quite a lot of my time doing the charitable work because I'm preparing all, I'm in charge of the publications. So I'm sort of preparing all the publications. But so, yeah, there's me, there's Benny Peiser, is the boss of both organizations. Benny has been around the climate scene probably longer than any of us. He was running an email newsletter. So long before I got involved. It was called CCNet. So he was invited to become the first director of GWPF when it was set up by Nigel Lawson, Lord Lawson, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Margaret Thatcher. So obviously a very important UK politician. And it was the other person who set it up was David Henderson, who was an economist. So they set it up, and for a long time it was Benny and a deputy. And then I came on board part-time. Oh golly, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and I went full-time sort of 4 or 5 years ago. There's we have a big board of trustees who sort of run the if you like, the governance of the organization. They're a mixture of sort of financiers, academics, and just worthy people. There's some politicians. We had the Bishop of Chester at one point. He's not with us anymore. And we have a big panel of academic advisors as well, who so if we produce an important paper, we will ask them to review it and sense check it. So yeah, that's everybody from Richard Lindzen to Bill Kininmonth, climate scientists. There are economists. There are Matt Ridley, the science writer. Yeah, there's some big names on there. Actually, it's one of the things we find is that actually, if you go, people are surprised at the intellectual firepower we have behind the organization. Because we're portrayed in the left-wing press, particularly as a bunch of cranks. And then you show somebody the academic advisory panel, and they're all virtually professors, and and in major universities, Oxford and Cambridge and things like that, and they go, oh wow, you're actually not quite what we were led to believe. So yeah, that's nice that these people are willing to work with us, because it takes a degree of bravery, I think, for these people to actually say, I'm gonna become involved with GWPF, because we do go places that people don't want people to go, and we say things that are upsetting to people. It's the thing about climate change is, the people who believe in it, they do deeply and sincerely believe in it mostly. And it's really important to them. It's part of their being. And they really believe that we're all going to fry if we don't get some more wind farms. And if you say no, they find it really hard to compute that. It's irrational. It's a religious belief. It's not, we'll come back to the thing I said earlier. It's not rational. You can't rationalize them out of it. It's an interesting organization, GWPF. Yeah.
Yeah. You did have a paper by Richard Lindzen on your website, just a pretty new one, right?
Yep. We've just done a paper from Richard Lindzen just now, which it's funny. We've had Richard and Bill Kininmonth we probably ought to explain to readers. So Richard Lindzen is probably, has a reasonable claim to be the most important climate scientist alive. The story goes, I heard that he was the only atmospheric scientist in the US National Academy of Sciences at one point, before all the climate thing took off, and then everybody was an atmospheric scientist. But we've done one by him, and a paper also by Bill Kininmonth, who used to run the Australia's National Climate Centre. And both interestingly, questioning the greenhouse effect, or at least the greenhouse of, not the basics of the greenhouse effect. Yes, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but they're just saying where the IPCC goes with that idea is not right, and it's simplistic. And actually, there is if you develop a more sophisticated way of looking at the question, you end up with completely different conclusions about the size of the problem that we face. I just found it very surprising that, 20 years in, people were saying, these two important guys were saying essentially the same, very similar things, and opening up questions that I'd kind of just gone, okay, that must be settled, because everybody agrees that it's a greenhouse gas, just about. And then suddenly these guys are going, well, yeah, there's a bit more to it than that. Because I haven't spent a lot of time on greenhouse theory. It's not where my focus has been. I did paleoclimate for a long time, and I've moved into energy. But yeah, the greenhouse effect is not something that I've spent a lot of time on. It's something that people write to us at GWPF all the time saying, you need to look at this. I've disproven the greenhouse effect. Come and have a look at my essay. And in an ideal world, you would love to say, yes, we'll spend a week trying to analyze what you've done, and we'll send it off to all our academic advisors and get them to look at it too. But in reality, you can't do that. You have, we're a tiny organization, and we have to direct our fire where we think we can be most effective. And frankly, the greenhouse effect isn't it. So yeah, so it was quite interesting that they came through with that. The thing we've done in recent years with Net Zero Watch is to very much remove our focus away from climate and onto energy, because we felt that the problem is, if you're trying to persuade the public, or you're trying to persuade politicians of anything, getting into the details of the greenhouse effect is not going to float their boat. It's not going to happen. So we did feel that we were not going to be effective by focusing on the science. We still do the science, just because some of the people who give us money want us to do the science, and it's interesting, and interesting things come out of the science. But we just felt we could be much more effective by looking at policy, and in particular the cost of net zero. This has been the big focus since the middle of the pandemic. There really were things to do on that area. Now, this is kind of where I've kind of come into my own there, because back in the day, my first job was as an accountant. I trained as an accountant before I got bored of that and sort of went on to things that were much more interesting but less well paid. I've been able to add quite a lot there. So we've done lots of work on just saying what is the net zero project costing you, each household now? What's it costing you today? And the numbers amazing, actually. I mean, it's thousands of pounds per household every year already, and we've only really just started. And we've looked at what it might cost you at the end of the day, because we have this thing called the Climate Change Committee here in the UK, which is the government's official advisors on decarbonisation, and they came up with this crazy figure, and they said it's going to cost 1 to 2% of GDP, £50 billion a year. And I went, no, don't be stupid, it's going to cost nothing like that. So I put in a freedom of information request, and I said, I want your calculations. And of course, they said, no, you can't see them. And they came up with all sorts of excuses. And there's a whole sort of legal process you have to go through. And they spent tens of thousands of pounds trying to stop me getting these numbers. And eventually it ended up in court in London, and they lost. So we got the figures, and the figures were hilarious. They were they didn't rise much above the level of outright fraud. I mean, one of the things they said was net zero is going to be very cheap, because shifting transport to electric, to EVs, is going to save everybody money. And I went, okay, how does that work? Because an EV is kind of like twice the price of an ordinary car, isn't it? So I went and looked at their numbers, and behind the numbers, it said you can buy an electric vehicle today for £11,000. Well, I mean, that's wrong by a factor of 3. I mean, it's triple that. That's what it costs for an EV. And they said, so, you can buy it, that's saving you, it's half the price of an internal combustion engine car now, and for every year till 2050. And it was just, the numbers were fictional, absolutely astonishing. And we got a whole lot of newspaper stories out of that. So yeah, that has been useful in that I think it started some people asking questions about what this is all going to cost. I still find it, I get quite distressed now though when I see people repeating the official number of 1 to 2% of GDP, and I just go, it's a lie. It's not true, but they carry on doing it. We spent a lot of time looking at the cost of renewables because there's this story that does the rounds that the cost of all renewables is falling through the floor, and the cost of offshore wind has halved and the cost of onshore wind has halved. And again, it's not true. So the advantage we have because we are over-regulated here in the UK, again, there is a silver lining to that cloud in that you can get the financial accounts of every single offshore wind farm in the UK. So you can see exactly what their costs are. So, and you can see that while the industry is saying that the cost has halved, in fact, we got the first offshore wind farm in 2002, and every wind farm that came on stream after that until 2013 was more expensive. Okay, and since then the costs have stabilized a little bit and come down. So in the UK the long-term cost of gas-fired electricity is about £40. So offshore wind is 120, so it's 3 times the cost. That's a cheapish one. They go up to nearly 200, some of the more expensive ones. Onshore wind's 80 or 90. Solar is over 100. So everything is 3, 4, 5 times the cost of gas, the long-term cost of gas. Obviously, currently gas is quite expensive. But our policies are being built around the idea that renewables are cheap. I mean, and of course, that's just the cost of the generator, and then you have all the system costs added on top. And again, getting that message through to politicians is just really hard. They don't want to hear it. It's an article of faith that renewables are cheap and they're getting cheaper. Amazing. How do you speak to these people? Very hard.
You're finding out the real truth by filing FOIA. That's how you get
the financial accounts of wind farms. You can just go onto a website and they're there free for everybody to download. FOIA it's increasingly almost more trouble than it's worth because the bureaucracy has decided their best thing to do is just to delay. So, you send in the request and you're meant to get an answer within a month, and, they don't reply in a month. And then you write them another letter saying, right, okay, you have to reply or da, 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 da. And then a month after that, you'll get a reply saying, oh, sorry, we'll get onto it. Okay. And they delay and they delay and they delay. So I've got the Department of Business has published some figures on the cost of renewables, which I look at and I go, yeah, I don't believe those. They're ridiculous. They look nothing like my figures, and my figures are from accounts, so they're real numbers. So I want to see how they've got these numbers. So I've asked for their spreadsheets, and that I've been waiting for 18 months for those now. And, what will happen is eventually they will be told by the regulator to release them, at which point they'll refuse, and then we'll go to court. And it costs everybody lots of money. And it's a crazy thing. It's very hard. I mean, the last time I did this with the Committee on Climate Changes, I got a supporter, paid for it. And, it's several tens of thousands of pounds to get a barrister to stand by you and hold your hand, because it's not the kind of thing I can do on my own. And I think we'll be going through that again. So yeah, I've almost given up on that. I only do it if it's really, really important now, because you need money to make it work. And we don't have that much money.
Seems interesting that if the truth is on their side, why would they fight the FOIA?
Yeah. Do you know, I mean, I think there is an element of that's just bureaucrats being bureaucrats. They just go, no good can come of having information in the public realm. Therefore, we will just not release it because, it's safer that way. Certainly, they did get, obviously, with the Committee on Climate Change stuff, they did get into a lot of trouble because there was a lot of newspaper articles saying that they had been, at best, incompetent, and if at worst, something, considerably more awful. So, okay. I've probably got a bad reputation, and they probably just won't give stuff to me anymore.
So what would you say has been some of your more effective outreach on either Net Zero Watch or GWPF? Like Twitter seems to be going pretty well. for
Twitter.
net zero?
Yeah, Twitter has grown pretty well. We are, I guess we struggle with a lot of social media because I mean Facebook, put warnings all over us and things. So that's Facebook hasn't been great for us. We've had one or two things on YouTube. Again, we're not big on YouTube just because it takes a lot of time, but we did, little clips of Jordan Peterson talking about global warming. We did a little clip of him, which got 1 million views or something. That was great. And there was we did some stuff on David Attenborough and polar bears because David Attenborough had been saying, the polar bears were all dying. So we did some stuff on that, a little video on that, which did really well. We did some great investigative stuff actually on, do you remember the story with David Attenborough and the walruses falling off a cliff? Remember that story? Had some great fun we did on that, actually working out where the pictures came from to prove that it was, because we knew that there had been a record of walruses falling off a cliff at this place in Russia. And so, we got down to sort of analyzing photographs of the place that we knew where it happened, and then looking at the David Attenborough's film and seeing if the rocks were the same shape. Okay. And we actually got an exact match. And it was such a fabulous find because then you could prove that they were lying. But again, David Attenborough's a saint. So it just, nobody cares. It doesn't matter that you've shown that the story was a crock.
The story was that carbon dioxide was supposed to be the reason why the walruses fell rather than polar bears, wasn't it?
Correct. The story was that there was no ice left for the walruses, and the walruses therefore all went onto land, and they went up the cliffs and then they fell off the cliffs. But in fact, they've always gone onto the beach there. They've always gone up onto the cliffs, and they were actually driven off by polar bears who have learned to drive them off the cliffs, because then you don't have to bother fighting them. They hit the ground at the bottom and there's lunch all ready for you.
So Attenborough knew that full well that polar bears were involved, didn't he?
Well,
didn't he?
I think that is right. I'm trying to remember the details now. I think he did. Yes, I think we have concluded that he did know. Susan Crockford, who I imagine certainly some of your readers will know, writes a lot about polar bears and Arctic mammals from a sort of a climate skeptic point of view, has done a detailed analysis of this, and her conclusion was that he must have known. The thing is, Attenborough is essentially a voiceover artist. He's not actually there in the Arctic. They had film crews out there filming the polar bears and the walrus. He's 90, whatever it is. He doesn't go on these trips anymore. He just records. There were two series came out of the filming. So there was one for Netflix and there was one for the BBC. And in the Netflix one, he said, "Yeah, there's polar bears driving them over the cliff." And in the BBC one, it was climate change.
Very interesting.
Madness.
This has been really good. So I think we're ready to wrap up here. Thank you very much, Andrew Montford. And could you actually let us know where we can find you on social media and which books of yours we should read before we sign off?
Okay. Well, if you want to read my books, then I suggest you, first of all, get hold of The Hockey Stick Illusion, which you can get on Amazon. And the follow-up to that is called Hiding the Decline. And you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is a dissentient, which is perhaps not the easiest one. But okay. It's actually, I'll tell you the story behind that. That's John Stuart Mill, the 18th century philosopher, referred to people, what you might call skeptics today, a dissentient afflicted with the malady of thought. So I'm a dissentient afflicted with the malady of thought. So yeah, that's my Twitter handle. And so Net Zero Watch is netzerowatch.com.
Okay. All right. I'll put that information in the show notes too about the books and the website. Thank you very much.
It's been really good fun, Tom. I enjoyed it.
Talk to you later.
Take care.